Hey everyone, it's been a long time since I've made a video, aside from just random reviews of shoes or whatever kind of bullshit that you've seen on my channel for the last few months or even years. But I want to get back into making some cool gaming content, and I'm going to start this off by making a video about one of my favorite game franchises of all time, and that's Dark Souls. Dark Souls has always held a really special place in my heart, something that I've shared an experience with my brother. We both played it together and with friends on multiple occasions. So I'm going to make a video today about why Dark Souls 1, for me personally, is better than Dark Souls 2. And I know this has been probably done to death, and I know there's a lot of people who have very strong opinions about both games. And for me, it's not about looking at Dark Souls 2 and saying, oh, it's a piece of shit. It's why Dark Souls 1 to me is personally a better experience and why I had a more enjoyable experience with the game. Also, I just wanted to say that this video comes from an article I wrote years and years ago when I was writing for a small little gaming publication called Gen Game, and I will be making some adjustments to the content within it, but for the most part, these are viewpoints that I had written down back in 2014-ish. So I wanted to come at it from using some of the pieces that I've already put together. In the future, I plan on having obviously some newly scripted stuff, but I just wanted to preface this by saying this is an older article that I'm turning into a video. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this, and I'll be back with more hopefully in the future very shortly. Despite the game's 2011 release date, I didn't actually pick up the original Dark Souls until it went on sale for $5 on Xbox Live in 2014. And even all these years later, in 2018, I can honestly say without any hesitation that it is easily one of my top 5 games of all time, probably number 1. And I know that's a pretty bold statement, so let me explain. Like any passionate Nintendo fan, I grew up loving games from the Legend of Zelda series, specifically Ocarina of Time. I remember jumping out of the car as a kid every single day after school and bursting into my room where I'd slap my Ocarina of Time cartridge into my N64. You want to know why I was so excited to play that game? Because I was excited to go on an adventure, to get lost in a land of mystery, the very same reason I felt so compelled to play Dark Souls each day after getting off work. What Ocarina of Time did for me in my childhood, Dark Souls has done for me in my adulthood. Within a few weeks of defeating Dark Souls 1, I picked up Dark Souls 2, because after putting in over 100 hours into a video game and not really knowing what to do with myself after completing the story, I'd begun to feel a bit hollow. Sorry, anyway. What I failed to realize until after I started playing, however, is that Miyazaki, the director of Demon Souls and director and producer of Dark Souls, had stepped down from his role during the development of Dark Souls 2 to focus more on the game's online component and the production schedule. This was concerning to me, as Miyazaki had been in charge of approving concept designs for previous installments in the Souls series, meaning he acted as the primary source of direction for a visual depiction of each game, the level design, the difficulty, etc. And sure enough, his lack of direction cracked through the thin, albeit resplendent, at times, surface of Dark Souls 2 early on, as I could tell shortly after beginning my journey that the land of Drangleic lacked the same sense of continuity found in Dark Souls' Lordran. In fact, the world of Dark Souls alone is what allows it to surpass the likes of its successor in almost all categories, the most important of which being fluidity of design. You're probably asking yourself, what does he mean by fluidity of design? As I'm well aware that it makes me sound like a completely pompous YouTube/video game critic, let me explain. When breaking down the main components of what makes Dark Souls so unique, we must first start with the locations used to construct its world. From the Undead Asylum to Firelink Shrine, to the Undead Parish, all the way up to Honor Londo, Dark Souls feels connected, despite its diverse array of locations, with a labyrinth of tunnels and passageways all interconnecting with one another. While each location acts as a level of sorts,
Never once did I feel as though I was progressing through successive stages. Rather, I felt as though I was traversing a living, breathing world full of mystery and danger. And seeing as Lordran is a land of giants, every location exudes a sense of grandeur, making the player feel small and helpless. But that's the beauty of it. You are a measly helpless hollow who must overcome trials and nightmares far greater than your own persona, in a land starved for nourishment, a land of death and desolation. Again, what makes this work so well is the connected nature of each of the game's locations. Together, they combine to paint an intricately detailed landscape with elements that complement one another and somehow meld together in terms of design, despite changes in locale, specifically the Undead Parish in Ocarina. Still, in order to fully grasp the game's sense of continuity, we must look at its creatures, many of which feel very rooted in dark fantasy. And yet hydras, golems, and dragons somehow end up meshing well alongside the likes of Sif, a giant wolf, and Ornstein and Smo, Ocarina's golden-cloaked bosses. This odd mix of fictional and familiar organic beings acts as a catalyst for the world of Dark Souls, through which lore and questions are spawned in a much more refined way than Dark Souls 2. With that lore comes an added layer of depth to the game. It is a layer that does in fact exist in Dark Souls 2, but doesn't carry over quite as well in my opinion. Now this is where things start to get a little dicey because I'm about to make some pretty polarizing statements. To begin, the ability to fast travel in Dark Souls 2 from the very beginning of the game is a detriment that pushes against one of the staples of the series, exploration. While Dark Souls feels connected and fluid, Dark Souls 2 feels disjointed and packaged into small, individualized levels. The feeling of grandeur and excitement when entering into a new area has been replaced by the all-powerful travel mechanic that forces you to go back to Majula every time you want to level up. That, by the way, is another issue entirely though. What frustrates me most about the sectioning off of levels is that it diminishes the stakes of the game. Granted, Drangleick's landscape is a bit more vast in scope compared to Lordran, but giving the player a fast travel mechanic from the get-go was a misinformed decision, and one that only serves to underwrite the huge amount of work that went into creating the world of Dark Souls 2. Plus, with so many locations to warp to, hardly any of them become memorable, aside from Majula since it acts as a central hub. And my theory on this is that because you have to backtrack in certain areas of Dark Souls 1, locations have more meaning, they hit harder, they become more familiar. Whereas in Dark Souls 2, it's kind of one and done, you go through the level, and that's it. It's almost as if each location was built as a level rather than a location, meaning placement of traps and enemies outweigh the overarching design of the world. And as a fan of the original game, I was saddened to see how bland and uninspired many of the levels in Dark Souls 2 are, with many of them feeling much smaller in scale compared to the likes of Ocarina or the Duke's Archives in the previous game. And even though Dark Souls included a fast travel mechanic as well, it doesn't allow the player to utilize it until halfway through the game, forcing anyone brave enough to endure the initial onslaught of baddies to venture from location to location on foot, soaking in the magical mysteries of the land as they progress. And to clarify, Dark Souls 1 is by no means a perfect game, especially from a design standpoint. There are huge areas that are incomplete in the game, textures that don't render properly, textures that don't even exist. So I'm not saying that it's perfect, but the way the worlds are connected and the mechanics by which you have to traverse them feel much smoother and better in Dark Souls 1. Touching on enemies and bosses in Dark Souls 2, I found that many of them look rather odd and out of place, with some of them reflecting the classic vibe from the first game, and others looking like rehashed World of Warcraft bosses, for example the Smelter Demon. And to me, this is where Miyazaki's absence really became apparent. While working on previous titles, my guess is that Miyazaki would meticulously look over every single design implemented within his games before giving concepts the okay. Well, I mean, he was the director after all, and that's their job. He knew what looked good and what would work well within the world of Dark Souls and Demon Souls when placed alongside other creatures and geographical locations. Designs were simple yet unique, stylized but with an added touch of elegance. It's not that enemies and bosses necessarily look bad or completely out of place in Dark Souls 2, but their bulky nature causes them to look over-exaggerated for the most part. Dark Souls feels connected and together, both in terms of location and its creatures, and especially where they fall within the world, whereas Dark Souls 2 simply does not. Possibly one of the most frustrating alterations made to Dark Souls 2, however, is the massive texture downgrade the game underwent between April 2013 and the game's official release on March 11, 2014. As you can see, Dark Souls 2 used to look much more like its predecessor, with dynamic lighting and more refined textures combining for a more visually enticing game. Looks definitely aren't everything, but the contrast between where Dark Souls 2 started and where it ended up is somewhat staggering. Of course, this is commonplace today, with E3 trailers showing the most beautiful version of the game possible in order to drum up hype. But many developers dial down the visuals when putting everything together, likely allowing them to make the game run smoother, which makes games like BioShock 1 and Infinite, the Tomb Raider reboot, and Horizon Zero Dawn, to name a few, so impressive from a visual standpoint. I personally would have been fine with sacrificing some drops in frame rate in exchange for a better looking game, but what's done is done. However, it should be noted that I'm talking about the original version of this game, not the Scholar of the First Sin edition on current-gen systems. I haven't played it, but from what I've seen it looks much, much better than the original release in terms of graphics. But okay, enough about graphics, as they are a small part of all of this. Let's move on. So at this point, I've covered the overall layout of the game, the designs of the enemies, and the drop in textures. Now I'd like to focus on a core gameplay mechanic, the kick. This is a small gripe I had with the game upon my initial playthrough, but it stood out to me, so I thought I'd bring it up in this video. Why the decision was made to remove the infamous kick from Dark Souls 2 is beyond me, but it's a damn shame because its replacement, the guard break, was completely buggy. At least it was when I played the game in 2014. Maybe it was just my Xbox 360, or maybe the gods of video games just f***ing hate me, but I couldn't for the life of me get it to work more than about 40% of the time. And I can't tell you how many times I went up to guard break an enemy only to have it negated by some magical source of sorcery spawned up from the omnipotent coding buried deep within the game. Clearly, this frustrated me, as I'm sure it would anyone who wants to play a game built upon the foundational idea of combat as a primary function of gameplay. Dark Souls was by no means perfect either, but at least you knew using the kick mechanic would work nearly 100% of the time. I even found old Steam community threads on the exact topic, and it seems like it could have been a 60 FPS glitch, but either way I feel good knowing it wasn't just me struggling with this. Anyway, on to the always exciting topic of hitboxes. Okay, so you're standing face to face with an enemy, and just as he's about to bring his sword down to strike, you quickly roll out of the way, successfully dodging the attack. Regardless of which game you're playing, dodging is essential to the combat in the Souls series. Unfortunately, I've noticed some major issues with the hitboxes in Dark Souls 2. Again, I'm not sure if it's just me or if this is a widespread issue, but on numerous occasions, I was hit by an enemy attack either while rolling or without ever being touched by the enemy's weapon. I've learned over the years that some of these hits were due to my low agility level in the game. If this isn't ringing any bells for you, let me lay things out for you. In Dark Souls 1, rolling was divided into 3 classes based on your equipment load. 100% equipment load caused a slow roll, or a fat roll as it's come to be known in the community. 50% caused a medium roll, and 25% caused a fast roll. The percentage also affected the distance of the roll. In Dark Souls 2, equipment load correlates to roll distance, and the cutoff before your character begins to fat roll is 70%. In Dark Souls 1, your roll distance and speed are tied to your invincibility frames, or iframes, while dodging an attack. So if you played the first game and you jumped over to the second one, you would assume that rolling works in a similar manner due to the inclusion of slower roll speeds based on how much gear you have equipped. And that's where you would be completely wrong. Iframes in Dark Souls 2 are tied to your agility stat, which are broken down as so. Note that 105 agility grants 13 iframes, which is equal to a fast roll in Dark Souls 1. This is incredibly convoluted and needlessly complex for one of, if not the most important action in the entire game. I'll take the blame for not reading this stat on my initial playthrough, but why was this needed? Who wanted a separate stat for your iframes? It's ridiculous and makes you focus on something that should be handled within the back end of the game based on how much equipment you're carrying, like in Dark Souls 1.
Oh my god! How did it get me from that far away?
Anyway, this wasn't the only issue I ran into regarding hitboxes in Dark Souls 2. The game is all over the place in terms of how it registers hits, grabs by bosses and enemies alike. There were times when I was close to 15 feet to the left of a boss attack or a grab and the hit would register on my character. Enemies' weapons would clearly be above or below me or to the left or right and would still cause damage. The game felt rushed and broken. The only thing I can think of is that there are some major issues with the hitboxes in Dark Souls 2 that cause them to expand or lag in certain situations. Regardless of what the issue is, it is an annoyance and a blight on the game's combat system, especially since every hit counts in these types of games. Combined with the whole iframe change, taking damage when you feel that you shouldn't have becomes the main staple of this game, unfortunately. There are many other aspects of Dark Souls that make it a better game than its sequel. Weapon crafting, NPC progression, and armor variation, to name a few. But what remains at the core of the original game's success is its ability to captivate the player and draw him or her into a beautifully crafted fantasy landscape. While this can easily be said of Dark Souls 2 feels like an unrefined collage of ideas, pasted on top of one another without any uniform theme to hold it all together. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like more videos on the topic of Dark Souls, please let me know in the comments section, and be sure to drop a like and smash subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much. See you next time.